Captain Jake Morrison was having what he generously called a morning, though on Zirion 7 the concept of morning was more of a philosophical suggestion than an actual time period. The planet's 3 suns took turns hiding behind each other like cosmic shy kids, which meant daylight happened whenever it felt like it. Jake had given up trying to maintain a normal sleep schedule about 6 months ago, and now operated on what he called coffee standard time. He was currently on his 4th cup of the day, which by his calculations meant it was either breakfast or dinner, when Ambassador Clethvar burst through the research station's main airlock like he was being chased by tax collectors. "Captain Morrison," Clethvar announced, his reptilian features arranged in what Jake had learned to recognize as maximum bureaucratic panic. "We have a situation of the utmost gravity." Jake looked up from his coffee with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just been told they needed to file their taxes in triplicate. "Let me guess. The supply ship is late again, the atmospheric processors are making that weird humming sound, or someone forgot to feed the lab rats." "Worse," Clethvar said, his scales shifting from their usual olive green to what Jake privately called, "oh crap, yellow." "Much worse. The locals have deposited their offspring near your facility." Jake blinked slowly, the way people do when they're trying to process information through a caffeine haze. "Come again?" Clethvar pulled out what looked like a tablet made of crystallized anxiety and began reading from it with the solemnity of someone delivering a eulogy. 2 juvenile Velkari specimens, approximately 6 months of age, have been observed within 50 meters of this station. According to Galactic Protocol 847b, I am required to inform you that approaching these creatures will result in immediate and catastrophic death. "Death," Jake repeated flatly. "Catastrophic death," Clethvar corrected, as if the adjective made it significantly worse. Jake set down his coffee mug, which bore the cheerful inscription, "Galaxy's Okayest Captain," and walked over to the main observation window. Sure enough, there were 2 small, fluffy creatures sitting just outside the station's perimeter fence. They looked like someone had crossed a tiger cub with a teddy bear and then dipped the result in glitter that shifted between silver and blue depending on the angle. "Those things?" Jake asked, pointing at what were quite possibly the most adorable creatures he'd ever seen. "Those little fluffballs that are currently playing with what appears to be a piece of space debris?" "Those are not fluffballs," Clethvar said with the horrified tone of someone watching a toddler play with dynamite. "Those are Velkari death cubs. Their purr can melt titanium. Their claws can slice through molecular bonds. When they're happy, they emit concentrated energy beams from their optical organs." Jake watched as one of the cubs rolled onto its back and began batting playfully at a floating spore with paws that sparkled in the weird Zarian sunlight. "So you're telling me they shoot laser beams when they're happy?" "Precisely. And right now they look pretty happy. Which is why you must evacuate immediately." Jake turned back to Clethvar, who was now clutching his tablet like it was the last life preserver on a sinking ship. "Ambassador, I've got a question for you." "Yes." "In your expert diplomatic opinion, exactly how stupid do you think humans are?" Clethvar's scales shifted to a color Jake had never seen before, sort of a confused purple-brown. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "Because the way you're explaining this situation, it sounds like you think I'm going to look at those adorable little space kittens out there and think, gee, I should definitely go pet them, without taking any precautions whatsoever." "Well," Clethvar said, consulting his tablet again, "according to the Galactic Database of Human Behavioral Patterns, your species has a documented tendency to attempt physical contact with any creature you perceive as cute, regardless of its actual threat level." Jake stared at him. "We have a file? 17,000 pages? Single-spaced." Jake looked back out the window where the cubs had apparently gotten bored with the space debris and were now engaging in what could only be described as the most adorable wrestling match in galactic history. "And what else does this file say about us?" Clethvar scrolled through his tablet with increasing desperation. "That you consistently ignore expert warnings, possess an irrational attachment to creatures that could kill you, and have a disturbing tendency to give inappropriate names to dangerous xenobiological specimens." "Well," Jake said, taking another sip of his coffee, "at least they got us figured out." Outside, one of the cubs let out what sounded like a purr crossed with a wind chime. A small section of the fence post nearest to it began glowing cherry red. "See?" Clethvar pointed frantically. "Death? Catastrophic death." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Noted. Hey, do we have any of those sandwich crusts left from lunch?" Clethvar's scales had now shifted to what Jake was starting to think of as impending nervous breakdown mauve. The ambassador clutched his tablet tighter and launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. Captain Morrison, you clearly don't understand the severity of this situation. The Velkhari are the most feared warrior species in 3 galactic quadrants. Their adults can tear apart battle cruisers with their bare claws. Their cubs, while smaller, possess all the same capabilities in concentrated form. They're essentially biological weapons of mass destruction, wrapped in deceptively appealing fur. Uh-huh, Jake said, still watching the cubs through the window. One of them had discovered a small maintenance drone and was now chasing it in circles, making little chirping sounds that were probably melting the drone's circuits but looked absolutely precious. Furthermore, Clethvar continued, warming to his theme, Velkhari parents are notoriously protective. If they discover that aliens have come into contact with their offspring, they will assume hostile intent and respond with overwhelming force. The last species that accidentally encountered Velkhari cubs was the Zinthari Empire. Right, got it. Don't touch the murder fluffballs, or their parents will end civilization as we know it. Jake turned away from the window and nearly walked into Dr. Emma Rodriguez, who had apparently been standing behind him for the entire conversation. Oh, hey Emma, how long have you been there? Emma held up a small bag of what looked suspiciously like bread crusts. Long enough to hear about our new neighbors. I've been watching them for about an hour through the lab monitors. Clethvar's scales immediately shifted to code red, panic orange. Dr. Rodriguez, please tell me you haven't made physical contact with the creatures. Define physical contact, Emma said in the tone of someone who is definitely about to make things worse. Any interaction whatsoever that involves touching, feeding, or communicating with the specimens. Emma looked thoughtful. Well, I haven't touched them. Good, Clethvar said, visibly relaxing. I did throw them some leftover sandwich crusts about 20 minutes ago, though. If Clethvar had been human, Jake was pretty sure he would have started hyperventilating. As it was, his scales cycled through several colors that didn't exist in any human language before settling on existential crisis purple. You fed them, he said faintly. They made Lois look hungry, Emma said with a shrug. And they made these little mewing sounds when they saw me through the window. Plus, the smaller one kept trying to dig under the fence to get closer to the station. Jake looked back outside. Sure enough, there was a small, cub-sized hole under the perimeter fence, and both cubs were now significantly closer to the building. They appeared to be having an animated conversation with each other, complete with gestures that involved their sparkly paws. Dr. Rodriguez, Clethvar said in the careful tone of someone explaining quantum physics to a goldfish, you have potentially triggered a diplomatic incident that could result in interspecies war. Have I, though? Emma asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I fed a couple of hungry kids. They seemed pretty grateful, actually. The bigger one even did this little bow thing. As if summoned by her words, both cubs looked up at the observation window and, upon spotting the humans, began what could only be described as enthusiastic tail wagging. Their eyes lit up, quite literally, with a soft golden glow that made the window glass shimmer. They're looking at us, Jake observed. They'll remember you, Clethvar said to Emma with the horror of someone watching a horror movie where the protagonist decides to investigate the creepy basement. Velkhari cubs imprint on food sources. You've essentially adopted them. Cool, Emma said. Do you think they like peanut butter? Dr. Rodriguez, this is not cool. This is the opposite of cool. This is whatever temperature the heat death of the universe will be. Jake watched as the cubs began making their way toward the station's main entrance, their little paws leaving tiny glowing footprints in the dirt. You know what, Ambassador? I think we're going to need a bigger coffee pot. Captain Morrison, are you not grasping the severity of this situation? Oh no, I get it completely. We've got 2 adorable space tigers who shoot happy lasers from their eyes, and apparently we've just become their favorite humans. Honestly, after 6 months of nothing but equipment malfunctions and questionable food shipments, this is the most interesting thing that's happened since we got here. Clethvar stared at him in what Jake assumed was disbelief. You're pleased about this development. I'm saying it beats filling out maintenance reports. Outside, the cubs had reached the main entrance and were now sitting patiently by the door like the world's most dangerous welcome committee, their tails swishing back and forth in perfect synchronization. What happened next could only be described as the most catastrophically adorable first contact scenario in recorded galactic history. Jake, displaying the kind of decision-making skills that had gotten humanity banned from 12 different star systems, opened the door. Hey there, little guys, he said to the cubs, who immediately began purring like tiny jet engines. Emma says you like sandwich crusts. Clethvar made a sound like a deflating balloon mixed with the death rattle of his diplomatic career. Captain Morrison, step away from the creatures of mass destruction. They're cubs, Ambassador, look at them, they're wagging their tails. And they were. The cubs had apparently decided that Jake was the best thing since sliced bread, which, given that Emma had literally fed them sliced bread, wasn't entirely unreasonable. The smaller one, which had distinctive silver markings around its eyes, rolled over to expose its fuzzy belly in the universal gesture of "please give me attention." "Oh my God," Emma said, pushing past both men. "It wants belly rubs." "Dr. Rodriguez, no," Clethvar pleaded. "Dr. Rodriguez, yes," Emma said, and promptly sat down to scratch the cub's stomach. The cub's purring intensified to the point where the station's windows began vibrating in their frames. Its eyes glowed brighter, and little sparkles of light danced around its fur like the world's most dangerous disco ball. "See?" Emma said triumphantly. "It's happy. Look how happy it is." The second cub, apparently not wanting to be left out, padded over to Jake and began rubbing against his legs like an oversized, potentially lethal house cat. "This one's got blue markings," Jake observed, bending down to examine the cub more closely. "Kind of looks like racing stripes." "Don't name them," Clethvar said desperately. "Whatever you do, don't give them names." "I wasn't going to name them," Jake said. "But now that you mention it, this little guy does look like a Sparkles. And this one's definitely a Mr. Whiskers," Emma added, continuing to provide belly rubs to what was presumably the most dangerous creature she'd ever touched. Clethvar began typing frantically on his tablet, muttering what sounded like prayers in several different languages. Over the next few hours, Jake learned several important things about Velkari cubs. First, they were apparently capable of basic tool use, as evidenced by Sparkles figuring out how to operate the automatic door controls. Second, they were surprisingly good at fetch, though their version involved throwing chunks of asteroid debris instead of sticks. Third, and most importantly, they seemed to have the supernatural ability to make grown humans act like complete idiots. Chief Engineer Pete Kowalski, a man who regularly wrestled with fusion reactors and considered himself immune to cute things, lasted exactly 37 seconds before he was on the floor, letting Mr. Whiskers climb all over him. "They're just so fluffy," Pete said in wonder, as Mr. Whiskers settled down for a nap on his chest. "And warm. Really warm, actually. That's because their internal body temperature is approximately 400 degrees Celsius, Clethvar said, still documenting what he was now calling the incident for his inevitable report to the Galactic Council. Peebo said, "That explains why my back doesn't hurt anymore." It was Emma who first noticed that the cubs weren't just adorable, they were accidentally useful. While playing with some loose cables in the engineering section, Sparkles had somehow managed to increase the station's power efficiency by 30%, just by purring near the main generator. "It's like they're little living batteries," Emma explained to Jake while Mr. Whiskers demonstrated his ability to charge a tablet by napping on it. "Their bioelectrical field seems to boost our equipment performance." "So let me get this straight," Jake said, watching as Sparkles successfully played what appeared to be a video game using only his paws and sheer determination. "We've accidentally adopted two creatures that the galaxy considers weapons of mass destruction, and they're improving our technology just by existing near it?" "Pretty much. And they like belly rubs." "In belly rubs." Jake looked over at Clethvar, who was still frantically typing. "How's that report coming along, Ambassador?" "I'm up to page 47, Clethvar said without looking up. Chapter 12 is entitled, How Humans Turned a Potential Genocide Scenario into a Daycare Center. I'm not sure the Council is going to believe this actually happened." "Probably not," Jake agreed. "Hey, do you think they'd like to learn poker?" By evening, which on Zirion 7 meant that 2 of the 3 sons had decided to take a break, the research station had been completely transformed. The cubs had claimed the main common area as their personal playground, and the humans had apparently accepted their new role as full-time entertainment staff. Emma had fashioned what could generously be called beds out of spare thermal blankets, though the cubs seemed to prefer sleeping in a pile with whoever happened to be sitting still for more than 5 minutes. Pete had discovered that the cubs could supercharge the station's engines just by napping in the engine room, which he considered the greatest engineering breakthrough of his career. Jake, meanwhile, had made the tactical error of reading them a bedtime story from the station's digital library. Both cubs had been completely mesmerized by his dramatic reading of The 3 Little Pigs and the Big Bad Space Wolf, and now apparently expected this to be a nightly tradition. "This is unprecedented," Clethvar said, watching as Jake reached the part where the 3rd pig builds his house out of reinforced neutronium. "In all of galactic history, no species has ever successfully domesticated Velkari cubs." We haven't domesticated them, Emma pointed out. We're just hanging out. Dr. Rodriguez, they're wearing sweaters. Emma looked down at Sparkles, who was indeed wearing a small thermal vest she'd modified to fit him. It gets cold at night. They might survive in the vacuum of space. But why should they have to when we have perfectly good sweaters? Clethvar closed his tablet and sat down heavily in the nearest chair. I'm going to need so much therapy after this. Outside, the first of Zirion 7's 3 moons was rising, casting everything in a soft blue glow. The cubs had finally settled down for the night, curled up next to Jake's chair like the galaxy's most dangerous space heaters. You know what the weirdest part about this whole situation is? Jake said quietly. What? Emma asked. I'm actually starting to feel sorry for their parents. When they show up looking for their kids, we're going to have to explain that we accidentally turned their fierce warrior cubs into spoiled house pets who expect bedtime stories and regular mealtimes. Clethvar's scales shifted to what Jake had learned to recognize as impending doom gray. Captain Morrison, there's something I forgot to mention earlier. What's that? Valkyrie parents always come looking for their cubs. As if on cue, the station's long-range sensors began beeping with incoming ships. The first thing Jake noticed about the Valkyr warships was that they didn't so much land as they did perform what could only be described as a controlled act of atmospheric violence. 3 massive vessels, each roughly the size of a city block and apparently carved from a single piece of black metal that seemed to absorb light, descended through Zirion 7's atmosphere with the subtle grace of falling anvils. Well, Jake said, watching through the observation window as the ships settled onto the planet's surface with enough force to create their own small craters. I guess the parents are home. Clethvar had progressed beyond panic into what appeared to be a state of resigned acceptance of his own doom. His scales had settled into a color Jake had never seen before, sort of a matte gray that suggested the ambassador had achieved inner peace through the complete abandonment of hope. Captain Morrison, Clethvar said, with the calm of a man who had looked into the abyss and decided to pack a lunch, it has been an honor serving with you. I want you to know that in my official report I will note that your deaths were the result of unprecedented stupidity, rather than malicious intent. That's surprisingly thoughtful of you, Jake replied, still watching as massive cargo ramps began lowering from the warships. Though I notice you said deaths, plural. Planning to stick around for the show? My diplomatic immunity expired the moment Dr. Rodriguez gave those creatures names. Emma looked up from where she was attempting to explain the concept of breakfast to Mr. Whiskers, who was currently wearing a small hat she'd made from a spare napkin. Oh, come on, guys. How bad could it be? They're just worried parents looking for their kids. Pete, who was lying on the floor while Sparkles used his chest as a launching pad for increasingly elaborate acrobatic maneuvers, snorted. Emma, those aren't just parents. Those are Valkyrie warrior-class battle cruisers. Each one of those ships probably has enough firepower to glass a continent. Right, but they wouldn't just start shooting without talking first, would they? Emma asked. I mean, that would be rude. The first figure to emerge from the lead warship answered that question pretty definitively. Even at a distance, it was clear that this was not a being who prioritized politeness over efficiency. The creature stood roughly 9 feet tall, moved with the fluid grace of a predator that had never encountered anything it couldn't kill, and was covered in what appeared to be natural armor plating that gleamed like polished obsidian. There, Clethvar said quietly, is War Chief Thaxara of the Valkyrie 3rd Fleet. She once destroyed an entire pirate armada because they were blocking her parking space. Parking space? Jake asked. It's a very loose translation. The point is, she's not known for her patience or her willingness to engage in lengthy diplomatic discussions. War Chief Thaxara was followed by what was clearly her mate, a creature who somehow managed to look even more dangerous despite being slightly smaller. Where Thaxara moved like liquid death, her companion had the controlled stillness of a loaded weapon. Both of them were scanning the area with the systematic thoroughness of professional soldiers who expected trouble. How many more are coming out of those ships? Emma asked, as more Valkyrie warriors began emerging from the other vessels. Standard search and rescue formation, Clethvar said, consulting his tablet with the detached air of someone reading his own obituary. Probably about 60 warriors total, all of them trained from birth to respond to threats against Valkyrie cubs with overwhelming violence. Jake watched as the war party began moving toward the research station in a formation that was both beautiful and terrifying to observe. They moved like a single organism, each warrior positioned to provide maximum coverage while maintaining clear lines of fire. It was, Jake had to admit, probably the most professional military operation he'd ever seen. "You know what?" Jake said, finishing the last of his coffee. "I'm starting to think maybe we should have read the fine print on those galactic protocol documents." There were 17 volumes of fine print, Clethvar pointed out. Still, the Velkari formation reached the station's perimeter fence, where War Chief Thaxara stopped and examined the small hole that Sparkles had dug earlier. She made a gesture to her warriors, who immediately spread out to surround the entire facility. Then she did something that Jake found far more terrifying than any display of military might. She threw her head back and let out a call that seemed to combine the roar of a lion with the sound of tearing metal. It was clearly some kind of parental summons, and it was loud enough to rattle the station's hull plating. Inside the common area, both cubs' heads snapped up immediately. Sparkles, who had been in the middle of attempting to eat Pete's shoelaces, suddenly looked very much like the deadly predator he was supposed to be. Mr. Whiskers abandoned his napkin hat and moved to the window, with the fluid grace that reminded everyone present that he was in fact a biological weapon of mass destruction. "Oh," Emma said quietly. "They know their mom's here." But instead of running toward the entrance or making their own calls in response, both cubs did something that made Clethvar's scales cycle through several colors that didn't exist in most languages. They looked at Jake with expressions that clearly said, "Hide us." "Captain Morrison," Clethvar said faintly, "I believe the cubs are attempting to use you as protection from their own parents." Jake looked down at Sparkles, who had positioned himself behind Jake's legs and was peering around them toward the window, like a child hiding from an angry teacher. Mr. Whiskers had taken refuge under Emma's chair, though his glowing eyes were still visible in the shadows. "Huh," Jake said. "That's probably not a good sign." War Chief Thaxar's voice came through the station's communication system with the clarity of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. When she spoke, it was in perfect, if somewhat formal, standard galactic. "Inhabitants of the research facility, you are harboring Velkari offspring. Surrender them immediately, and your deaths will be swift." Jake looked at Emma, who was now protectively crouched next to Mr. Whiskers. He looked at Pete, who had sat up and was staring at Sparkles, with the expression of someone who had just realized he was emotionally attached to a creature that could melt his face off. He looked at Clethvar, who was holding his tablet like a shield. Then he activated the station's communication system. "War Chief Thaxara, this is Captain Jake Morrison of the Terran Research Station Zerion 7. We appreciate you stopping by, but I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding here." There was a pause that lasted just long enough for Jake to wonder if he'd just made the last mistake of his very short life. "Explain," came the reply, in a tone that suggested explanations had better be both brief and convincing. Jake looked down at Sparkles, who was still using him as a human shield while somehow managing to look both adorable and guilty at the same time. "Well," Jake said, "it's kind of a long story, but the short version is, your kids showed up here this morning. We fed them some sandwich crusts and now they don't seem to want to leave. Also, one of them learned how to play video games, and the other one figured out how to supercharge our fusion reactor. Oh, and they're both wearing sweaters because Dr. Rodriguez was worried they might get cold." The silence that followed this explanation was so complete that Jake could hear the station's air recycling system humming in the background. Finally, War Chief Thaxara's voice came back through the comm system, and for the first time she sounded less like a military commander and more like a confused parent. "They're wearing what?" What followed could only be described as the most awkward parent-teacher conference in galactic history. War Chief Thaxara entered the research station with the kind of controlled caution that suggested she was prepared for anything from a hostage situation to a full-scale firefight. What she was clearly not prepared for was the sight of her eldest offspring wearing a tiny thermal vest and sitting in what appeared to be a makeshift blanket fort. Her mate, who Jake learned was named Kethmore, moved through the door behind her with his weapon systems clearly active, but held in a non-threatening position. Both parents stopped dead in their tracks when they spotted their cubs. Sparkles, upon seeing his parents, made a sound that was somewhere between a guilty whimper and a purr. He looked at Jake, then at his mother, then back at Jake, clearly torn between family loyalty and his newfound appreciation for humans who gave him belly rubs and taught him card games. Mr. Whiskers, displaying either more courage or less sense than his sibling, actually trotted over to his parents with his tail held high, apparently expecting the same kind of enthusiastic greeting he'd been getting from the humans. Saxora knelt down to examine her younger son, her massive clawed hands moving with surprising gentleness as she checked him over for injuries. When she found none, her glowing amber eyes fixed on the small napkin hat that was still perched between his ears. "What?" she said slowly. "Is that on his head?" Emma, displaying either tremendous bravery or a complete lack of survival instincts, stepped forward. "Oh, that's just a little hat I made him. He seemed to like wearing it, and it's actually quite practical for keeping the sun out of his eyes when he's playing outside." Daxara stared at Emma with the expression of someone trying to process information that didn't fit into any of her existing categories of experience. "You made clothing for my son." "Well, yes, both of them, actually. Sparkles has that thermal vest, because Pete noticed he seemed to prefer the warmer areas of the station, and Mr. Whiskers kept losing his hat, so I made him 3 more. Kethmore, who had been silently observing the interaction, finally spoke. His voice was deeper than his mate's, with a rumbling quality that Jake could feel in his chest. "You named them." "Oh," Emma said, suddenly looking uncertain. "I hope that's okay. They just seemed like they needed names, and Sparkles has those beautiful silver markings around his eyes, and Mr. Whiskers has this adorable way of twitching his whiskers when he's concentrating." Jake watched as both Velkari parents exchanged a look that contained what appeared to be an entire conversation in micro-expressions. Finally, Thaxdora turned back to Emma. "Show me," she said simply. "Show you what?" "Show me what you have taught my cubs." Emma looked at Jake, who shrugged in the universal gesture of, "Well, we're already in this deep, might as well keep digging." She walked over to where Sparkles was still lurking in his blanket fort and sat down cross-legged beside him. "Okay, Sparkles," she said gently. "Can you show your mom and dad how you learned to shake hands?" Sparkles looked at his parents, then at Emma, then carefully extended one front paw toward her. Emma shook it solemnly, and Sparkles' purr kicked in, causing the nearby equipment to hum with increased efficiency. Thaxar made a sound that Jake was fairly certain was the Velkari equivalent of "what the hell." "That is not a Velkari greeting," Kethmore observed. "No," Emma agreed. "It's a human greeting. We shake hands when we meet someone new, or when we want to say goodbye, or sometimes just to be friendly." "And you taught this to my son." He picked it up really quickly. "He's very smart, they both are. Watch this." Emma pulled out her tablet and activated a simple puzzle game. "Sparkles, can you show them the game we've been playing?" Sparkles padded over to the tablet with obvious enthusiasm and began manipulating the touchscreen with his claws. Within moments, he had solved a puzzle that was designed for adult humans. "He's actually gotten better at this than I am," Emma said proudly, "and Mr. Whiskers figured out how to operate the door controls on his second day here." Thaxador watched her son play the puzzle game with an expression that Jake was beginning to recognize as parental bewilderment. It was the same look he'd seen on the faces of human parents when their kids demonstrated some new skill that was simultaneously impressive and completely inexplicable. "This is not normal behavior for Velkari cubs," she said finally. "Well," Pete said, deciding to join the conversation, "maybe that's because they've never had the chance to be normal cubs before." All eyes turned to him, and Pete suddenly looked like he regretted speaking up, but he pressed on, displaying the kind of stubborn honesty that had gotten him into trouble with authority figures his entire life. "Look, I don't know much about your culture, but from what Ambassador Clethvar told us, Velkari cubs are supposed to be training for warfare from the moment they can walk, right?" Kethamore nodded slowly. "So, when have they ever had the chance to just be kids? To play games that don't involve combat training, to take naps in the sun without worrying about whether they're being sufficiently fierce?" Thaxara looked down at Mr. Whiskers, who had apparently decided that the conversation was boring and had curled up next to her feet for a nap. His tiny snores were creating small puffs of glittering energy that danced in the air. "They might seem content," she said quietly. "They by seem happy," Jake corrected. "There's a difference. Content is accepting your circumstances. Happy is when you purr so hard that you accidentally improve our fusion reactor efficiency by 40%. "He did that?" Kethmore asked, looking at his sleeping son with what might have been pride. "First day," Pete confirmed. "Took a nap in the engine room and somehow optimized our entire power grid. We're running better than we have since the station came online." Thaxara was quiet for a long moment, watching as Sparkles abandoned the tablet game in favor of attempting to teach Emma how to properly pounce on a ball of yarn that had somehow appeared from the station's supplies. "In Velkari culture," she said finally, "cubs are considered adults at 6 months of age. They undergo the trials of claws and fire, and those who survive join the warrior caste." "And those who don't survive?" Emma asked gently. "There are no cubs who do not survive," Thaxara said, but there was something in her voice that suggested this wasn't entirely true. "It is not permitted." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as he began to understand what she was really saying. How many cubs actually make it through these trials? The silence that followed was answer enough. Kethmore moved closer to his mate, and Jake noticed for the first time that both of the adult Velkhari bore extensive scarring that spoke of lives spent in constant conflict. But when Kethmore looked down at his sons, there was something in his expression that transcended species barriers entirely. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "there are other ways to measure strength." Emma, who had apparently decided that diplomatic protocol was less important than making sure everyone felt included in the conversation, looked up at both parents. "Would you like to learn how to play the blanket fort game? Sparkles invented it, but he's been trying to teach it to all of us. I think he'd really like to show you." Thaxara, war chief of the Velkhari Third Fleet, conqueror of 17 star systems, and terror of the Outer Rim, looked down at her son's expectant face and made a decision that would probably be discussed in military academies for generations. She sat down on the floor. "Show me," she said. What followed was perhaps the most surreal hour in the recorded history of interspecies relations. War Chief Thaxara learned how to construct a proper blanket fort, discovered that her claws were surprisingly useful for securing corners, and found herself on the receiving end of detailed instructions from Mr. Whiskers on the proper technique for crawling through blanket tunnels without collapsing the entire structure. Kethmore, meanwhile, became fascinated with the concept of bedtime stories and insisted on hearing Jake's complete repertoire, which unfortunately consisted mainly of half-remembered human fairy tales and whatever he could improvise on the spot. The sight of a 9-foot-tall alien warrior listening with rapt attention to Jake's dramatic interpretation of Goldilocks and the Three Space Bears was something that Jake was pretty sure would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. "I do not understand," Thaxara said during a brief pause in the fort-building activities, "why my cubs prefer this to combat training." Emma, who was currently serving as a load-bearing wall for the fort's main chamber, considered this carefully. "Maybe because this is the first time anyone's ever asked them what they wanted to do instead of just telling them what they had to do." Sparkles, overhearing this conversation, padded over to his mother and did something that made every human in the room collectively hold their breath. He climbed into her lap and began purring. Thaxara looked down at her son with an expression of wonder that transcended any language barrier. Slowly, carefully, she began to stroke his fur with one massive claw. "This sound," she said quietly. "I had forgotten that cubs could make this sound." "He purrs a lot," Emma said softly. "Especially when he's happy, or when he's helping with the reactor maintenance, or when someone's reading him a story." "Stories," Thaxara repeated, as if testing the word. "We could teach you some if you'd like," Jake offered. "Sparkles has some favorites." Ketham looked up from where he was attempting to follow Mr. Whisker's increasingly complex fort-generating iron instructions. "You would do this?" "Of course," Emma said. "I mean, if you want to learn. No pressure." Jake watched as both Velkhari parents exchanged another one of those wordless conversations. When they turned back to the humans, something had shifted in their expressions. "We would like to learn," Thaxara said formally, "about stories and games and why our cubs have become attached to beings who should, by all rights, be their prey." "That's easy," Pete said, emerging from the depths of the blanket fort with Mr. Whiskers riding on his shoulders. "It's because we're good at pack bonding with anything that doesn't immediately try to kill us, and sometimes even with things that do." Clethvar, who had been silently documenting this entire exchange for what was now a 90-page report, looked up from his tablet. "I'm going to need a much larger database," he said faintly. 3 months later, Jake Morrison found himself in a situation he never could have anticipated when he first signed up for deep space research duty. He was sitting in what had formerly been the station's main conference room, reading The Very Hungry Space Caterpillar to an audience that included 2 Velkhari cubs, their warrior parents, a delegation of visiting Galactic Council members, and Ambassador Clethvar, who had given up on maintaining any semblance of diplomatic dignity and was now openly taking notes on human storytelling techniques. "And then," Jake continued, doing his best to inject dramatic tension into a children's story, "the caterpillar built himself a cocoon and went to sleep for a very long time." Sparkles, who was wearing his 4th different sweater of the week Emma had discovered online shopping, raised a paw. "What's a cocoon?" "It's like a blanket fort," Mr. Whiskers explained, with the authority of someone who had become the station's unofficial expert on human customs, but for bugs who want to turn into butterflies. "Why would a bug want to turn into a butterfly?" asked a small voice from the back of the room. Jake looked up to see the newest additions to their rapidly expanding daycare center. 2 young Zephyrian cubs, whose parents had arrived the previous week, ostensibly to conduct diplomatic negotiations, but actually to drop off their children after hearing rumors about the human child care specialists of Zirion 7? That, Jake said, closing the book, is an excellent question for tomorrow's story time. Right now, though, I believe it's someone's nap time. A collective groan arose from the assembled youngsters, which included not just the original Velkari cubs but also the Zephyrian siblings, a young crystalline entity that communicated through light patterns and had somehow learned to giggle, and what appeared to be a small dragon from the Outer Rim territories, whose parents had insisted was just going through a difficult phase. War Chief Thaxara, who had initially planned to stay for only a few days to retrieve her cubs, stood up from her position as designated nap supervisor. Over the past 3 months, she had not only learned the finer points of blanket fort construction, but had also become surprisingly adept at negotiating bedtime with beings who could melt steel when they had tantrums. "Come along, little warriors," she said, though her tone was considerably gentler than it had been during her first visit. "Rest is an important part of training." "This isn't training, Mom," Sparkles pointed out as he padded toward the sleep area that had been constructed in what used to be the station's secondary lab. "This is nap time. They're different things." "Yes," Thaxara said patiently, "but warriors need rest too." "Are we still going to be warriors when we grow up?" Mr. Whiskers asked, a question that had been coming up with increasing frequency as the cubs learned more about different ways of living. Thaxara exchanged a look with her mate, who was currently helping the Zephyrian cubs arrange their collection of smooth stones into what their culture considered proper sleeping formations. "You will be whatever you choose to be," she said finally. "Warriors, explorers, storytellers, engineers. The choice will be yours." Jake watched this exchange with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from seeing something fundamentally good happen in a universe that didn't always make room for fundamental goodness. The transformation in the Velkari parents had been gradual, but profound. Thaxara still carried herself like the military commander she was, but she had learned to temper authority with affection. Kethmore had discovered a talent for mechanical engineering that rivaled Pete's, and had actually improved several of the station's systems through what he called applied destructive analysis. More importantly, both parents had officially petitioned the Velkari High Command to suspend the trials of Claws and Fire, pending a comprehensive review of alternative childhood development programs. The petition had been accompanied by a 47-page report on the improved cognitive and emotional development observed in cubs raised in mixed-species cooperative environments. The political ramifications of this decision were still being debated in councils across the galaxy, but Jake was more interested in the practical results, which could be observed every day in the form of 2 young Velkari who had learned to express affection through means other than ritual combat. "Captain Morrison," came a voice from the station's communication system. "You have an incoming transmission from the Galactic Council." Jake sighed and made his way to the communications center, where he found Counselor Vexai waiting on the main screen. The counselor was a tall, ethereal being whose species Jake had never bothered to learn the name of, mainly because they seemed to consider themselves above such mundane concerns as individual identification. "Captain Morrison," Counselor Vexai said without preamble, "the Council has reached a decision regarding your facility." "Oh, good," Jake said, settling into his chair with his usual enthusiasm for bureaucratic announcements. "I was wondering when you'd get around to that." After extensive deliberation and review of Ambassador Clethvar's comprehensive reports, the Council has voted to officially designate Research Station Zerion 7 as the galaxy's first Interspecies Childhood Development Center. Jake blinked. "Come again?" "You are being promoted, Captain Morrison. Congratulations on your new position as Director of Interspecies Relations and Childhood Development. I'm being promoted for what is essentially running a cosmic daycare center." The Council prefers the term Alternative Developmental Paradigm Implementation. Jake looked around the communications center, which had been decorated with drawings that various young aliens had made during art time. The walls were covered with pictures of spaceships, rainbow-colored planets, and what appeared to be a family portrait drawn by Mr. Whiskers that included every human on the station, as well as several stick figures that Jake assumed were meant to be his parents. "Counselor Vexai," Jake said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. How many other species have requested permission to send their difficult children to our facility?" There was a pause that Jake found deeply suspicious. "Currently, the waiting list contains approximately 437 applications from 62 different species." Jake stared at the screen. 437. The Council is prepared to authorize expansion of your facility to accommodate the increased demand. We're also assigning additional human personnel who have demonstrated aptitude for what your species calls pack bonding behavior. You're building us a bigger daycare center. We are funding a revolutionary approach to interspecies relations that has already prevented 3 potential wars and established diplomatic ties between species that have been enemies for millennia. Jake looked through the communications center's window into the main common area, where he could see Emma teaching a mixed group of alien youngsters how to play what appeared to be a modified version of tag that accommodated beings with different numbers of limbs, tentacles, and appendages. Pete was in the corner working on some kind of mechanical project with the help of 2 young crystalline entities, whose natural electromagnetic fields were apparently useful for precision welding. Near the observation window, Thaxara and Kethmore were engaged in what looked like a serious conversation with the parents of the young dragon, who had apparently set fire to something important on their home world and been sent to the humans as a last resort. "All right," Jake said. "I'll take the promotion, but I have some conditions." "Name them." "First, I want hazard pay. Not because the job is dangerous, but because I'm pretty sure I'm going to need therapy after the first time someone drops off a baby that can bend space-time when it cries." "Agreed." "Second, I want a proper coffee machine. The industrial kind they use on starships. If I'm going to be responsible for the childhood development of half the galaxy's problem children, I'm going to need serious caffeine support." "Reasonable." "And third, I want it officially noted in my personnel file that none of this was my idea. When some historian writes the definitive account of how humans accidentally became the galaxy's preferred babysitters, I want it clearly stated that we were just trying to be nice to some hungry cubs." Counselor Vexa's expression shifted into what Jake had learned to recognize as the alien equivalent of amusement. "Captain Morrison, that particular fact has already been extensively documented. Ambassador Clethvar's reports have become required reading at the Galactic Diplomatic Academy." "Really?" "His analysis of human pack bonding behavior is considered a masterwork of xenosociological research. He's been nominated for the Council's highest academic honor." Jake looked over at Clethvar, who was currently sitting in a circle with several young aliens, apparently leading them through what looked like a meditation exercise, but was probably actually a support group for beings whose worldviews had been fundamentally altered by prolonged exposure to human illogic. "And Clethvar, what happens to him?" "Has requested permanent assignment to your facility as Director of Cultural Integration and Documentation. Apparently, he finds the work endlessly fascinating from an anthropological perspective." Translation: "He's given up trying to understand us and decided to just take notes instead. It's a wise decision in the Council's opinion." Jake watched as Sparkles padded over to where his mother was sitting and climbed into her lap with the casual confidence of a child who had never doubted that he was loved. Mr. Whiskers had apparently decided that the serious parental conversation was boring and had wandered over to Emma's tag game, where he was now explaining the rules to a confused-looking Zephyrian cub. "You know what the really weird part about all this is?" Jake said to the counselor. "What's that, Director Morrison?" 6 months ago, if you'd told me I'd be running an interspecies daycare center in the middle of nowhere, I'd have assumed it was some kind of punishment detail. But watching these kids learn to play together, seeing their parents discover that there are other ways to raise children besides preparing them for war, I think this might actually be the most important job in the galaxy. "The Council concurs with that assessment," Counselor Vexai said, "which is why we're authorizing the construction of 12 additional facilities based on your model." 12 more? "To start with, early projections suggest we may need as many as 50 such facilities within the next 5 years. Jake leaned back in his chair and watched as Pete emerged from the nap area, moving with the careful quiet of someone who had just successfully gotten a room full of young aliens to go to sleep. The engineer gave Jake a thumbs up and mouthed the words, "All down for the count," before settling into a chair where he could keep an eye on the monitoring systems. "Counselor Vexai," Jake said, "I think we're going to need a lot more coffee." As the transmission ended, Jake found himself alone in the communications center, with the quiet hum of the station's systems and the distant sound of what might have been snoring, purring, or some kind of alien equivalent of contented sleep. Through the window, he could see the first of Xerion 7's 3 suns beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that never failed to remind him why he'd wanted to explore space in the first place. Emma appeared in the doorway, moving with the careful quiet of someone experienced in not waking sleeping children. "How'd the call go?" she asked. "We've been promoted to running the galaxy's premier interspecies daycare system," Jake said. "Apparently, we're Pioneers in alternative childhood development. Huh. Does this mean we get better equipment? And hazard pay? Excellent. Because I'm pretty sure that little dragon is going to need fireproof toys. Jake nodded toward the common area, where the soft sounds of various alien sleep patterns created a surprisingly peaceful symphony. Emma, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd actually listened to Clethvar's warnings about the cubs being dangerous? Emma considered this for a moment, watching as Thaxara quietly adjusted a blanket around her sleeping son. Honestly, I think the galaxy would be a lot lonelier place, she said. And we'd have missed out on the chance to learn that most problems can be solved with patience, snacks, and the occasional bedtime story. That's either the most profound thing you've ever said or the most ridiculous. With humans, those tend to be the same thing. Jake couldn't argue with that logic. After all, they'd just accidentally revolutionized interspecies relations by treating deadly alien weapons of mass destruction like the children they actually were. In the grand scheme of the galaxy, that seemed perfectly reasonable. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in Zirion 7's darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, Jake could hear the sound of incoming ships bringing the next group of parents who had heard about the humans who were good with difficult children. He reached for his coffee mug, which still bore the inscription, Galaxy's Okayest Captain, though he supposed he'd need to get it updated to reflect his new title. Director of Interspecies Relations and Childhood Development. He could live with that.